Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's CIG webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this next hour. My name is John Powell, and I am the Director of Membership Development here at CIG. And today, I've got the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar entitled Shifting Sanctions, How to Mitigate Compliance Risk More Effectively, presented by our friends at LexisNexis. Today's webinar is meant to be interactive, so please submit your questions throughout the presentations by typing them into the Q&A box below. However, I am going to have to hold all the questions until after the presentation, so please type your questions throughout. We hope to be able to get to all of them, but we'll share any we don't get to with the presenter. We'll also be sharing the slides, and I will push them out at the conclusion of the webinar. Before I proceed further, I do have a couple of housekeeping and calendar items I would like to review with you. Quickly, bullet point number 1, global events in North America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, the Asia Pacific region. Attend one of our signature events or share them with your colleagues. Please check the CIG website frequently for upcoming cities and current agendas. Webinars, you're on a webinar right now. CIG hosts them weekly. Visit our website for a complete listing of upcoming webinars and register today. CIG's peer-to-peer resource, this is an opportunity to ask top-of-mind questions for instant responses. Those inquiries go out on Tuesday and Wednesday, and you do not have to be a CIG member to respond to one. The Resource Center has been completely revamped. It is home to over 5,000 tools, templates, white papers, presentations, research documents, methodologies. All of it will make your job easier each and every single day. Also, CIG offers a career network with postings for sourcing professionals and internship opportunities for all levels of employment. We also have our Student Talent Outreach Program. This program was designed to find tomorrow's supply chain professionals today while the students are still honing their skills and learning about the industry. Please reach out to me directly if you have any questions or would like information about any of these programs. Global Executive Summits. These are semi-annual events with more than 350 decision makers in attendance. The entire summit agenda and event details are available online. Registration is now open for the fall summit. It's been open for a while. We're getting close to almost selling out. So it's a really popular event, October 9th through the 12th in Carlsbad. Golf is included on the 9th, the afternoon of October 9th. If you're from the buy side, it is free to play. Beware of hotel room pirates. What is a room pirate? If you're coming to the summit, this is an unauthorized group that attempt to contact anyone who might attend a CIG event. Room pirates typically call or email and tell you there is an urgent reason why you should book your hotel room with them. They may leave a message saying you urgently need to call them about this event. Do not fall for this scam. These calls and emails do not always identify the event properly. CIG will never, ever, ever ask you to book your hotel room. Ask you to book your hotel room through us. We will direct you to the Omni website or phone number directly. We have set up a secure web page with the Omni La Costa Resort for reservations. Please book all hotel rooms through this link. As CIG is gaining more of a global footprint, please take a look at some of the upcoming global events on the CIG website under the Networking Events section. If you have colleagues in any of these cities, please invite them to attend. CIG University offers training and development opportunities to people of all levels in their sourcing careers. We are currently enrolling for the next Certified Sourcing Professional and the newly launched Certified Supplier Management Professional course starting on September 18th. Once again, if you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to me directly, and I will get you the information immediately. Individual memberships. We recently launched a new individual membership program. As an individual member, you maintain your CIG membership no matter where your career takes you and can still utilize our membership resources like the SRC and attending our networking events. Visit cig.org/membership to learn more about the individual membership program. Today's webinar is brought to you by our friends at LexisNexis, and the title of the presentation is Shifting Sanctions, How to Mitigate Compliance Risk More Effectively. So a very warm welcome to today's presenter, Miss Karen E. Gray. And E stands for Elaine, so if you're looking for her on LinkedIn, feel free to type in the middle name. Karen has 23 years of experience at LexisNexis. Karen is a senior entity due diligence and monitoring specialist and serves as LexisNexis's expert and central point person on all supply chain management solutions. She is a resource for benchmarking, market intelligence, strategic category management, and vendor selection, and focuses on efforts to improve profitability and cash flow, risk mitigation, and operational efficiencies with regard to vendor selection and monitoring. She also serves on the CIG Resource Center Thought Leaders Council. Karen, we look forward to your presentation today, and with that, the mic and controls are all yours.
John, thanks so much. So again, to reiterate, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. LexisNexis is, of course, happy to partner with CIG today for the topic of building a robust sanctions compliance program. If you're not familiar with LexisNexis, we have been in business since 1973. We serve customers in more than 175 countries with more than 10,000 employees worldwide. We are part of the RELX Group, formerly known as Reed Elsevier, and we are a world-leading provider of information, analytics, and professionals and business customers across various industries. So with that, we will get started. More than half a century ago, the UN Security Council established the first sanctions regime in southern Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. Since 1966, the UNSC has enacted 26 sanction regimes, 13 of which continue today. Such small numbers belie the complexity organizations face maintaining sanctions compliance. Sanction regimes were devised as political apparatuses to prevent escalation or to settle conflicts. They were devised to curtail nuclear proliferation and counterterrorism and even human rights violations. While the current consolidated UN sanctions list only covers 13 sanction regimes, the document itself is 158 pages long, reflecting the extensive collection of individuals, entities, or states subject to sanctions. UN sanction regimes are subsequently adopted by supranational bodies like the European Union as well as individual nations. In addition, countries may have their own sanctions list related to specific regional threats or other national security considerations. So with that in mind, the webinar today will address why sanction compliance programs are not just for banks and financial services, what factors increase our exposure to sanction compliance risk, and how to create an effective sanctions due diligence and monitoring process. So what are sanctions? A sanction is defined as a threatened penalty for disobeying a law or a rule. There are many types of sanctions when assessing exposure to risk. As a result, organizations must navigate a complicated web of sanctions. And it's not just banks and financial institutions that are subject to these sanctions. Increasingly, companies across various industries have been targets of enforcement actions, probably most notably by the U.S. Department of Treasury's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which aggressively pursues sanction violations by U.S. companies. But what it also targets is foreign companies if they're publicly traded in the U.S. or if any U.S. person is involved. So let's talk about the various sanctions. There are diplomatic sanctions, simply a reduction or a removal of diplomatic ties. So when we start to look at ousting of ambassadors through embassies, this is a diplomatic sanction. Diplomatic sanctions are political measures that take to express disapproval or displeasure at a certain action through a diplomatic or, again, a political mean, rather than affecting the economic or the military relations between two such organizations or countries. Measures include limitations or cancellations of high-level government visits or expelling or withdrawing diplomatic mission or staff. We've seen that recently play out in the news. Now, there are also economic sanctions. This typically refers to a ban on trade. Now, this possibly gets limited to certain sectors like armaments, with certain exceptions like food and or medicine. Economic sanctions can vary from imposing import duties on goods to or blocking the export of certain goods from the target country to a full naval blockade of the target's ports in an effort to verify or curb or block specified imported goods. When you look at economic sanctions, those are distinguished from trade sanctions, which are applied purely for economic reasons. And so those typically take the form of tariffs or similar measures rather than bans or trade. Military sanctions we are perhaps familiar with because it calls for military intervention. Military sanctions can range from carefully targeted military strikes to degrade a nation's conventional or non-conventional capabilities to less aggressive forms of arms embargoes to cut off either supplies of arms or dual-use items. And we'll talk about dual-use items in a moment. Now, there are also sports sanctions preventing one's country's peoples from competing, prohibiting teams from competing. We haven't seen this in a while. Usually, sports sanctions are a way of playing psychological warfare on an intended target. This is used really to crush the morale of the general population of a target company. We saw this, or a country, we saw this back in the early 90s with Yugoslavia. We've seen several iterations of that through the 1980s with the British Lions tour to South Africa. We've seen that also with the South African Rugby Union tour in New Zealand. So sports sanctions is something that we might not all be concerned with today, just depending on our offset. But when we do have sporting events, if we are taking into consideration you're the sponsor for a large sporting venue, and that venue is not able to present those that are willing or able to come and play because of a sporting sanction, it might in direct effect your revenue from that event, your revenue sponsorship for a sporting venue. There are environmental sanctions to take into account. Since the declaration of the UN Conference of Human Environment, international environmental protection efforts have been increasing gradually. These sanctions on the environment include not only economic, but political issues such as trade, since they're all interdependent. The trade barriers and restrictions on trade are key factors since we're engaged at looking at the problems of not only endangered species, but also things like ozone depleting chemicals and anything protected by environmental laws. Now, there are sanctions and laws regarding the environment. Those are relatively new. There have been recent concerns over environmental issues, encouraging individuals and governments simply to act and cooperate in dealing with the problem at hand. The UN Security Council can also implement sanctions on political leaders or economic individuals. These persons typically have found a way of evading their sanction because of their political connections with their nation. But if you're familiar with PEP lists, PEP, PEP lists, this can also be supplemental to your sanctions compliance programs that you have individually established. So why are sanction compliance programs not just targeted for banks or financial services institutions? For years, banks and financial service companies were the primary focus of enforcement agencies. So in turn, and as a result, banks tend to have quite a vigorous sanction compliance program in place. Well, the same cannot be said for non-banking organizations, which is cause for concern given a growing focus on companies in other industries. Take this note, of 17 OFAC penalties that were levied in 2015, 9 of those 17 involved organizations outside the banking and financial services industry. One critical detail that was shared by those 7 of the 9 companies was the lack of a compliance program at the time of the sanction violation. Now, similarly, in the next year, 8 of 9 organizations subject to OFAC civil settlements came from non-banking industries, suggesting, too, that they had inadequate processes put in place or lack thereof to mitigate their sanction-compliant risk. Compounding the enormous scope of sanction regimes is the speed in which sanctions change. And we'll get to some particulars of that as we move forward. Let's take a look at this table. The penalties are staggering with regard to the economic impact or bottom line or ROI, however you want to look at that. But we have several companies and industries represented here on discovering penalties being on the rise. Alcon Labs in pharmaceutical, a handful of oil and gas with Natural Oil Well, CGG, and Halliburton. The agriculture community is not without this sort of scrutiny through Pan American Seed Company. The banking industry, certainly still there, but we also get down into some lesser-known industries with architecture and even medical devices with Hyperbranch and World Class Technology Corporation. Adam Smith, who has been a past chair of the Treasury delegation for the EU and the G7, he has most recently had talks with regard to the Russian sanction, and he is quoted as saying, to take the U.S. as an example, which has the most robust and well-tuned sanction system in the world, the number of sanction programs in the U.S. has increased by nearly 300% since the year 2000. The number of blacklisted entities, he further comments, has more than doubled in that period, and the speed with which entities are put on and taken off of those lists has meant that there are thousands of changes every year. Well, let's take a bit of a turn here and talk about what factors increase your exposure to sanctions compliance risk. Your organization can suffer reputational damage and or be subject to monetary penalties, government sanctions, civil suits, and even enforcement actions from various regulators if you're found to be working with individuals or entities that appear on sanctions lists. And that could extend to watch lists, blacklists, lists of excluded, disqualified, or debarred persons, and those represented by some organizations that you see on the left here. We're not just looking at OFAC. While OFAC is important, we're talking about terroristic watch list groups. We're talking about global lists like Her Majesty's Treasury Consolidated List. We might be looking at departments of state, departments or directorates of defense. We look at the union that is out of Europe, the European Union Designated Terrorist Watch List. We're also looking inside of the FBI, hijack suspects, most wanted list. There are terroristic watch list groups. There's also a list out there that I wasn't really familiar with today, or at least before today, called the Seeking Information List. And again, that all is under the guise and the umbrella of the FBI. There are certainly most wanted lists that come from an international or an Interpol purview. There are also alerts. There are certain things that municipalities in some of our large cities, some of our larger metropolitan areas that would be of interest to those who are seeking protection, seeking to look at people that have either come through on immigration visas or whatnot. So we are trying to look at those larger scales in regard to your risk as well. We're looking at UN lists. We're looking at anything from a U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security and looking at, again, denied peoples list or unverified list or even entity lists. So we're also looking outside of that banking and that financial spectrum when we look and see what is my third party made up of and who are the companies as well as the principals involved in that agreement between the two. On the right-hand side of our screen, these are just some everyday examples of things that might cause us to incur some sort of risk, whether that's through compliance or whether that's through sanctions. So think about in your mind who in your organization is tasked with monitoring things of this nature. Does it fit under your legal umbrella? Is it under your procurement, your sourcing umbrella? Is that under compliance? Is it a combination of all? Sometimes I have visited with customers on my own end, and sometimes that falls under an ethical sourcing initiative, and sometimes that falls to the chief ethics officer as well to run course. So we're looking at items here down the right-hand side that talk about everything from payment pattern to something as easily identified as a bankruptcy. We're looking at any sort of unauthorized business activities, any sort of warning list that comes out of something well-known like FINRA or other financial authorities like the SEC. We're looking at things like disqualified directors or debarred companies. Sometimes when I am using this kind of application with my customers, there is what's called a principals list out in the marketplace. It is a publication of DMB, but it is a list of principles for organizations who have gone out of business as determined by one of the largest credit bureaus globally. So when you look at someone who either runs companies into the ground or is at the helm of an organization when that company goes out of business, could that be tied to any sort of sanction or compliance risk? We probably need to surface that kind of information as such. We also need to take into consideration some sort of minor penal procedures or even civil procedures that sort of boils up and bubbles up to something of greater concern. And again, something like that you think, gosh, a civil procedure, do I have the bandwidth to tie back my due diligence process to that? Well, in maybe your threshold of acceptability, there are certain civil procedures or certain penal procedures that would otherwise usher itself to a higher tier of risk, thus leading us to be on watch for something with regard to compliance and or sanctions compliance risks. We also take into account things like money laundering and corruption. So whether that may make news lists or maybe that may make a list of international tribunals, certainly the monitoring of your Tier 1, your high critical suppliers, your sole source providers of either information services and or goods certainly warrants the need for not only an enhanced due diligence on the front end, but certainly a need for monitoring on the back end. We look at specialized lists, which maybe sometimes only plays out in the movies when we start to look at people that are associated with mafia or underground payments or even companies that are accused and or cited for using some sort of slave labor. Slave labor is present in more than 150 countries around the world. It does happen. Secured passports are taken from people who are working on projects until they finish. That is a modern-day slave labor initiative for companies that are sequestering workforces at bay, if you will. So those specialized lists, often hard to get our hands on with regard to even the most information-savvy companies. But again, those types of investigations do go on. Sanctions do get levied, and it's well worth our time and expense to be notified, if you will, of those types of intentions. White-collar crimes. Oddly enough, again, white-collar crimes lead to bigger and larger crimes, crimes against humanity, terroristic threats, and even non-financial sanctions. So how you view anything from a SAM list or otherwise is certainly important to critically look at these sanctions and compliance risks. When we start looking at a list or a complete list of sanctions and watch lists, they come from multiple authorities, as you can see the snapshot here. They are domestic, they are global. There are nearly 1,200 different types of watch lists that originate from more than 80 countries. So when we usher in and marry that with the multiple languages that those are partnered in and translated to, certainly being on the cusp of those 80 countries, 1,200 watch lists in multiple languages is critical to investing in with regard to manpower and or processes. As our global footprint deepens or as it darkens, so does our potential exposure to sanctions compliance risk. So let's talk about other factors that would increase our exposure to sanctions and compliance risk. By that, I mean geopolitical risk. Some of our more mature processes take into account country of origin for either goods or services or delivery to. Some of our more immature processes do not take into account geopolitical issues. We're going to spend some time talking about this for the next couple of minutes here. Geopolitical issues such as North Korea's recent rhetoric about its nuclear capabilities and missile testing and the ongoing conflict related to Russian seizure of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 from the Ukraine, they often lead to changes in existing sanctions. We've seen that play out. In March of 2016, U.S. sanctions against North Korea were expanded to include a ban against, and I quote, operating in North Korea's mining sector or to have purchased metal from any of its government officials, even directly or indirectly through a third country supplier. And this will make sense in a moment when we start talking about the Chinese impact and the mineral rights and who owns those. At the time, Reuters noted that more than 24 U.S.-listed companies have links to North Korean gold in their supply chains, and that's according to regulatory disclosures that were reviewed by Reuters, potentially putting these dozen or so companies, these 24 companies, at risk of penalties under the new U.S. sanctions against Pyongyang's mining sector. Now, in November of last year, the UN Security Council strengthened its sanctions again against North Korea. And just this year, the EU and U.S. expanded sanctions were used to address the country's discontinued or, as we've seen lately, the continuation of test firing of their ballistic missiles. So let's not synergize all on Korea. Let's talk about other parts of the world. The risk of trading with sanctioned entities is complicated by the way some sanctions may be used as a political football. I think we can all agree on that. Politicians and the media will often declare that sanctions on a particular company or country have been lifted, but the devil is really in the details, and some organizations or businesses or individuals may still remain on a watch list even after most sanctions have been reduced. So moreover, when we talk about an agreement to lift sanctions, it does not necessarily mean that these sanctions are lifted. The process of amending those sanctions policies can often take a great deal of time. So sanctions around the world are prevalent. We've taken a look at Korea. Let's take Cuba, for example. The U.S. imposed a trade embargo on Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, well before I was born, in 1959. But since December of 2014, we've seen a shift. President Obama had been gradually reducing sanctions on the country by using executive orders. More than 100 U.S. business delegations have since visited Cuba. Now, the president announced, and so did Starwood, which is a hotel company, that they had become the first U.S. firm to agree a deal or to enter into an agreement with Cuban authorities. Well, last September, the U.S. extended its remaining trade sanctions on Cuba until September 14th, a month from now. This means that most transactions between the U.S. and Cuba are still prohibited. The reduction of Cuban sanctions has largely come from the former President Obama through using executive orders rather than by Congress. So the sanction policy might change given that we have a new chief in place with Donald Trump in process or in office. Let's take Russia, another one that we're firmly familiar with in the news. The EU imposed sanctions on Russia's energy, defense, and banking sectors after its annexation of the Crimea in 2014. Now, these were due to expire last July, but EU leaders decided to renew the sanctions until this past January. In September, the EU also extended sanctions against Russian officials and pro-Moscow separatists in Ukraine by another 6 months. So that translates to asset freezes. It translates to travel bans, and that is holding against 146 officials and 37 firms. And that was in place until this past March. The U.S. Commerce Department added another 81 individuals to an export control list in September, and we've seen more of these actions surfacing in 2017. Well, we're no stranger to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, so let's take a look there. The U.S. imposed targeted sanctions on senior officials that were close to the DRC's president last September after the deaths of protesters and the president's apparent reluctance to hold an election. An army general and former police chief had their assets frozen, and France's foreign minister said European governments, quote, will discuss, end quote, imposing further sanctions. Again, the life cycle changes. There's so many changes with regard to how often and how frequent, but again, a quote from our friend Adam at Gibson Dunn tells us that there are more 1,000 changes in a year. Now, the UN, the EU, and Australia, and many other countries already maintain sanctions against the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these include everything from arms embargoes to freezing of the assets of certain PEPs, a travel ban on named individuals, the suspension of certain aid and development programs, the suspension of high-level bilateral government visits, and the list goes on. Now, what's the key here? Well, the DRC is one of the world's richest countries in natural resources. The African Business Magazine has tallied the value of the untapped mineral wealth in the DRC at over $24 trillion. So when we look for the UN and the EU for direction, the sanctions have benefited the Chinese businesses. China has bought half of the country's raw material exports, and they did so in 2012. So it's like the old saying, you follow the money. What else comes out of the Democratic Republic of Congo? The lithium that's in batteries that are used in our cell phones. So when we start talking about the transparency of third parties and their third parties, etc., we have to go to a geopolitical area to figure out where that original mineral or that original conflict mineral is coming from. Well, what about Myanmar? Let's move to another part of the world. There's recently been a significant step forward in relations between the U.S. and Myanmar. We saw that in 2012 when the U.S. lifted many of the trade sanctions that were put in place against Myanmar way back to 1989. And this all stemmed from human rights abuses. Last September, President Obama announced that the country should also benefit from what is called a preferential tariff as it emerges from decades of what is known as military rule in that part of the world. And sanctions were further reduced last October. Myanmar also has a vast resource capital of oil, of natural gas, and other minerals, yet most of its trade and foreign investment is, guess what, with Asian countries. So an advisor in Myanmar's leadership referred to the reduction of sanctions as, and he quotes, gold pot for the country. I would be remiss to say his name correctly, but Myanmar's leader at that time, Aung San Suu Kyi. And again, he refers to that lifting of those sanctions as a gold pot for the country. Now, despite this, some sanctions do remain in place. There is a watch list in Myanmar that includes at least 100 companies and individuals with links to the former military called the junta and trade in what do we call rubies and jade, somewhat like a blood diamond. So jade and rubies comes out of that part of the world. Well, let's move to Iran. We're all familiar some time ago that sanctions were imposed on Iran by the international community, having been reduced in recent years. In January, 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, and plus the European Union, they agreed to remove sanctions against Iran after it made commitments to give up part of its nuclear program. U.S. businesses have now begun to re-enter Iran. Last September, the U.S. Treasury Department allowed Airbus and Boeing to deliver planes to its capital of Tehran. But sanctions remain in place there, in particular around the banking sector. Sanctions have been lifted but could return if Iran at any point fails on its nuclear commitments. Now, the third point here is that non-American manufacturers wishing to sell to Iran must obtain an export license from the U.S. if their products include American-made materials. Some members of Congress have been critical of the President or of the Oval Office, regardless of who's there, by granting licenses to deal with Iran. Well, we would close this out with talk of the UK and the Brexit. Again, what was going on last summer still takes some note in our books today. Last April, a report by the UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee warned that if the UK left the European Union, it would have to, and I quote, reassess its sanction regimes. Now, it said that the UK had been one of the most influential foreign policy players in the U.S., noting that the UK had helped to lead negotiations around sanctions on Russia and Iran. The UK voted to leave the European last June, and Article 50, if you're tracking, has not yet been triggered. So the UK is said to unlikely leave the European Union until at least 2018. Well, when we look at that today in August, that's really just right around the corner. But at that point, the UK will no longer be bound by the EU's policy on sanctions. So what does that mean to us? Well, much of the UK's sanction policy comes from UN resolution, which will still bind the UK until it leaves the European Union. The UK also signed the deal to lift some of Iran's nuclear sanctions as a separate signatory to the EU. In March of 2016, the UK went one step further. They set up the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, which does suggest to the rest of the world that it is still committed to maintaining a tough sanctions regime. Nonetheless, when the UK leaves the EU, it will be looking to sign new trade deals, which certainly might change economic strategy and, frankly, the consequences of its sanctions policies. Companies in the UK that are keen to secure new businesses at an uncertain time for the country's economy might be tempted to make deals without doing proper due diligence. Again, encouraging the British firms and their perspective with their trading partners in countries such as Australia, they must keep a close eye on any of the changes to the UK's sanction policy once it does leave the European Union. Now, without comprehensive and agile sanction compliance strategies and processes, organizations and industries ranging anywhere from finance, extractive, and manufacturing to pharmaceutical, telecom, and transportation, they are vulnerable to substantial reputational, regulatory, financial, and strategic risk. So let me ask you, where are your third parties located? Do you know the geopolitical factors that are in your own supply chain? Well, we have some recommendations for that. As we move forward, we start to look at how to create an effective sanctions, due diligence, and monitoring process. A white paper that will be made available to you at the end of this webinar outlines 10 steps to support sanctions guidance. So let's take a high-level look at those 10 steps. Step 1, take a top-down approach to compliance. Enforcement agencies around the world, as we have seen, emphasize the importance of corporate leadership when it comes to creating a culture of compliance. It can't just bubble up from our legal group, from our compliance group, from our ethics group, from our sourcing group. It has to be a top-down approach. Investment has to be made in resources, whether that is technology resources or human capital, and that has to come from a budgetary perspective as well, again, from the board of publicly traded companies. Step 2, maintain up-to-date policies and procedures. Now, this includes disclosure requirements. It's based on any sort of guidance that you, whether you're in an industry that is highly regulated or whether you're not in an industry that's highly regulated. Chances are some or most of your third parties are at least affiliated with an industry that is under high scrutiny, whether that's through regulation or otherwise. So some of the examples that we usher to you is the UN Security Council, the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy, the UK Her Majesty's Treasury List, also out of the UK, the newly created Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, OFAC, which we're probably all familiar with, and individual countries. What's that footprint look like? What do the sanctions and the embargoes and so forth look like in individual countries? Has there been any sort of political change or discourse that would otherwise affect either the import, the export of goods, services, call center workers that you may have in place, etc. The statistic to take away from this slide is that 56% of all companies lack a well-defined sanction compliance policy. Always room for improvement, and we discover a couple of those as we move forward. Now, step 3, once it comes from top-bottom, how do we make certain that we are infiltrated, that we marinate in what those policies are? Well, step 3, we allow for some clear communication of those policies and those procedures. Now, not just internally, not just through the ranks of management and or staff, but also externally. When's the last time that your organization ran some sort of compliance program for your third parties, for your suppliers, for your sales agents, for your business department? When your company goes through a merger and acquisition, or there is a divestiture or a spinoff or whatnot, we may think, good, great riddance, but what if we acquire a company? That training motion internally should also be taken into account with new colleagues who might not have ever seen a compliance training program or might be in need of those certainly valuable tips. Now, the fourth part is, and a real stem from number 3, actively train employees and third-party agents. When we start to train employee groups, whether they're in sales or whether they're in business development or whether they're in procurement, engage in their level of involvement with regard to sanctions and issues to be aware of. Another statistic to take home, 25% of companies offer compliance training only once every 2 years. And I just stated from authority that there are at least 1,000 changes a year, so we might need to usher up that online check mark, if you will, for our employees, our suppliers, and any third-party agent. I know we at LexisNexis have those in policy that we have to go through. It's an online, it's not a tutorial. We have a quiz at the end, and it is run through our HR department. So again, we have a couple of attempts to get it right, to make 100, et cetera, but certainly it keeps us in compliance with what even our company views as the potential exposure to risk with third parties. All right, let's look at number 5 here, implementing a risk-based sanctions screening process. There is absolutely no one-size-fits-all approach to sanction screening. You may do that through a third party of your own. You may do that through anything in adverse media relations. You may do that through any number of automated processes. But we value the motion of screening, of monitoring and protecting based on levels of risk that you face. So think about organization size. If we're dealing with a third party and it's a small, maybe it is privately held, that supposes some sort of risk that might not otherwise be ushered up by a large publicly traded company. Well, the reverse is also true. If it's a large organization that has decentralized processes and so forth, we want to take that into consideration and ask yourself the question, what is the threshold of acceptability when assessing that risk, compliance, sanction, or otherwise? Industry type is another one. Some of us are in industries that by nature are naturally a bit riskier than others. So when we start to look at things that invoke product recalls or safety of the general public, industry type may be just the necessary evil of doing business with a third party. So take that into account. What's our threshold of availability there? Talking about a customer profile, this sometimes steers to, is it a publicly traded company? Is it a privately held company? Are there things in their background with regard to solvency, filings that have been made on time, whether those are payments, delivery of goods and services? What do we know, feet on the ground, about that company that we're engaging with? Those profiles are sometimes stemming for us to look at the principles that are aligned with those third parties. So consider what part of that so-called background check would you extend to principles that you also send to third parties. I was at a customer just last week. Their IT department was somewhat in disbelief that the procurement department wasn't going to go with the recommended supplier. And when we were doing some investigation for this particular supplier, the IT department said, yes, but they're a great guy and their credit report looks great, except that they have about $5 million in sanctions that have been levied against them. And the procurement department was not moving off of their recommended course and finally said, if you want to talk about this, it needs to usher to the next level. We're not making that call. So just think about all the things that go in from your business analyst or your commodity managers and things. Sometimes we do need to take things on face value. Sometimes it is a handshake. That doesn't eliminate the kinds of risks that we would be posing ourselves in front of with a signed agreement. Think about products and services offered. Is it a sole source provider? Is it a product that we can get somewhere else? Is that product coming to us watered down or diluted? Is that service offered at a better price point, et cetera? And is there a risk of things like recalls or customer unadoption, if that's a word for us today, that they won't adopt the new level of a diluted delivery of service and or goods? Delivery channels, are we recommending things like rail as opposed to plane or as opposed to truck or whatnot? And what are the particulars about that transportation as a commodity, as a service provider that allows for us to screen against the hazmat and other items of interest with regard to delivery of goods and services? And again, we're going to put a footprint right here again on countries of operation, being able to marinate in the country, the risk, what do other sources say, the risk of doing business, the risk of putting people on the ground that are considered to be our employees in that space. So number 5, a really, really big and one to consider with regard to a step in effective monitoring. All right, steps 6 and 7, we look at aligning sanction screenings directly to your third-party due diligence procedures. So whether we're looking at sanctions lists, watch lists, PEP checks, in that due diligence procedure, we are helping, anyone is helping the entire organization if I'm the person in procurement, if I'm the person in compliance, if I'm the one that's pushing back because of an anticipated mitigation that I might have to mitigate later or frankly take to court later. We're looking at that risk more effectively right from the start. And then let's make certain that those procedures have some sort of escalation clause in their contract, both for whether they are being sanctioned from a governing body, if there is an inquiry, if they've been giving time to rectify the problem at hand, if there's even violation reporting. So if we start to look at that, make certain that your legal T's and C's protect you as the customer against some sort of violation that might come up into account, you know, some 2 or 3 years into a 5-year agreement with one of your third parties. All right, rounding out 8 and 9 here of our 10 steps, number 8 says, hey, take a step back, let's audit and regularly review our sanction screening policies. Let's review our procedures, let's review our training protocol. Are our own employees failing or passing too easily? We don't grade on a curve. Let's make certain that those procedures are in place so that all under the corporate umbrella are protected. We start to look again at those sanctions revolving over time. So whether those regimes change from a geopolitical perspective or whether those sanctions and watch lists are changing because of the 1,000 anticipated in the course over a year, boy, that sets us up for monitoring those third parties for a number of risks that could be in front of us. We certainly want to look at those sanctions lists and keep up with the pace of the change as the slide recommends. Now, number 9, reinforce policies and procedures. with an audit that is outside of your purview. Get an independent auditor, get an independent editing and testing group. Every 12 to 18 months is recommended at this point to keep in prospect with a full sanctions and compliance program. You may do it a bit more frequently. I think it depends really on your resources. But again, that independent auditor, much like in the financial space, should then report that directly back to the principals in charge or, frankly, the board in charge of a publicly traded company. And last thing to consider is don't wait for enforcement as a trigger to implement all the 9 steps before. Nobody wants to get in trouble and then be reactive to this motion. I have a point that is listed here. It's a Chinese telecom company called ZTE. They had an OFAC sanction that was levied against them. It cost them a $900 million fine. They had an additional $300 million assessed to them if they failed to meet the conditions of the resolution terms. They were given a 7-year suspended denial to export. They were given a 3-year probation. They had to implement a 1-year compliance and ethics program with outside oversight. And frankly, it cost them bottom line ROI net loss of $342 million. That can bankrupt any size organization. It causes risk much beyond the financial footprint. It's reputational, and again, so much more. We are closing in on our hour, folks. I want to illuminate one more slide for you here. It's a little bit small in font, but it is included in the white paper. A couple of steps here and a checklist to make you think about your processes of putting a process in place that will sustain any sort of compliance review. Let's all banner down to say, let's know our customers and our third parties. Have you had any individuals or entities that have been sanctioned, and or are they on any sort of list? And do you have a visibility into those individual customers, suppliers, and third parties? We recommend knowing your product and your service. The first one is so very important when we think about, is our product or service being used, and is there an application of military convenience, or is there a dual use application? We can all think back to the use of something like fertilizer being made to make a bomb. And so if we're a fertilizer manufacturer, producer, shipper, etc., we need to know where that product is going to end up. So we need to know the receiving country. We need to know the end use for that product. We also need to know more about our end users. Can we verify that the ultimate beneficiary is not already subject to sanctions? And if so, do we have an end use statement and a sanctions clause built into your current contracts? The last one is know the transaction. Let's make certain that our sanctions, that we are delivering those in the course of all of the regulated industries with third parties. Will there be any sort of agent representing our company on behalf of transporting your products? Let's make certain that we are transparent in the ways that those are involved in the transaction. I will repeat something that was on the first slide in closing. The increasing number of enforcement agencies and their increasing vehemence in enforcement makes the risk of not keeping up substantial. That is a quote that is part of this white paper that we are presenting today from Adam Dunn, cited earlier with the Russian solicitations for sanctions. He is currently on staff with Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. I would like to offer up a poll at this time. If you would like to receive a white copy of our complimentary white paper, it is entitled Better Safe Than Sorry, the case for building a robust sanctions compliance program. You simply have a yes, no. You have about 45 more seconds to answer that. As the poll comes to fruition on your own screen, we would like to open this up for questions. So I think, John, you're probably monitoring some of the questions that might have come in while we speak. We want to make certain that our people are out of here top of hour and honor the present. So, John, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Yes. Were there any questions that popped up?
I do have some questions in queue, so I'll get to them in just a second. I just want to remind everybody we do have a couple minutes left, so please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will try to get to each and every one of them in the approximately 4 minutes we have left. So I'm going to jump right in. And the first question that came in asks, what is a PEP?
Oh, what's a PEP? Okay, so if you missed it, a PEP is a politically exposed person. So that is someone who serves or has served in a prominent public function. So think about an individual who is really closely tied either by virtue of their position, like a president, or the influence that they may hold, like a legislature, for example. So when you're on a PEP list, it does suggest that you present a higher risk for potential involvement in corrupt activity. That includes bribery, that includes policy making. We oftentimes look at family members of heads of state, of government officials, things of that nature. So while I would say that our president, any president's family is on the PEP list, it is by nature of their closeness to the leader of any sort of country or head of state. So while we're not looking at perhaps a child in this perspective to be a politically exposed person, reminding us that we do have corruption and bribery that goes on throughout the states and throughout the world, that person could have influence over either, a business policy or some sort of lawmaking that is, that's on the cusp. That's what a PEP is, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I was sometimes we're afraid to ask. I was wondering that myself. Thank you for the clarification. Thank
Sure.
you. All right. We still have some time left, so please, once again, type your questions in, and we will get to as many as we can. But I do have a next question up.
Okay,
the question
John?
asks, sure, who enforces the FCPA?
Okay, so the FCPA is known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we've probably heard more about that in the last decade, but it was enacted in, I believe, 1977, and it is a federal law, and primarily it has two provisions. One addresses accounting transparency, so under the SEC Act. So when we look back at things like Dodd-Frank or the Sarbanes-Oxley or things like that, FCPA allows for that, or at least endorses that accounting transparency requirement. Think Enron, everybody. So think about those companies who are not transparent in their publication of their financial responsibilities. The other part of the FCPA concerns bribery of foreign officials. So while the U.S. Department of Justice is the primary enforcer of the FCPA, there is some latitude. There's a dotted line to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, but there's also some latitude given to any other authority, be that the act was enacted in 1977, any other authority to what's called coordinate the act's enforcement. So, if an anti-bribery or anti-corruption law gets, postured in the UK and the UK is doing business in the US, then really both acts, both laws, both governances do create really a firestorm here, or a perfect storm, if you will. You've got a bribery act. You've also got something with regard to Foreign Privacy Act, whether it's corruption or bribery going on. So, but yeah, all the way back to 1977, and certainly that has come to fruition over time with supplemental acts and supplemental things that we need to take step of.
Karen, thank you very much. You shared a ton of information with us today. Extremely knowledgeable, you always are, and I love to just love to see or hear your presentations and see your presentations when you're at the summit. So I'm so used to seeing you in person. I want to say see you in person.
That's true. Well, John, we've enjoyed it today. If there are other questions, I'm going to just advance the slide, just one more screen, or you can. My contact information is certainly on the last screen, and certainly you can follow me on LinkedIn if you need to pose a question outside of this, but we've really enjoyed our time with you today. I'll turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you so much. And as she mentioned, yes, the slides are coming out. If you're still on the webinar, you should see the slides being transferred over to you, so we are sharing them. Any questions, as she had mentioned, you can reach out to her directly on LinkedIn at Karen Elaine Gray. Put that Elaine in the middle, and her mother will be happy. So I do want to thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. Thank you, Karen, for sharing your insights with us. We look forward to connecting with you again soon, and we are now pushing out the slides, as I had mentioned. Thank you to all our participants. We will see you back here on August 29th for the next webinar with our friends at Mayor Brown discussing governing service provider relationships, tips for protecting your deal after the ink is dry. Thanks once again and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.